Okay, so now we're going to start on our search functionality, which is going to take a few videos because there's quite a bit to it. Now, you can see here that in the Movie Dates API documentation, we can make a GET request to search/TV to get TV shows, and then there's a separate one to get movies. And you can also search other things like companies, people, collections, but if we want movies, then it's search movie. Now, we need to send, obviously, our API key. We also need to send a query because that's going to be the text that we need to search for. And then later on, we're going to have pagination, so we also need to work with the page query string. Now, the way that this is going to work is going to be a bit different than you might think. So instead of having just a submit event listener on this form, we're actually going to have this submit to the search.html page. And then as soon as we hit that page, we're going to fire off a search function that will then set everything out, like to get the request, to put the data in the DOM and all that stuff. All right, now up to this point, we've been using one function called fetch API data to get our data from the API. We're going to have a separate function called search API data because the request is much different. You could change around the fetch API data function we've been using if you want, but I'm just going to create a separate function for that. All right, now just to show you what happens here, so if I search for Goodfellas, which is one of my favorite movies, what happens is that because of the way the form is set up in the HTML, we get the type, which is movie, and we get the search term, which is Goodfellas. So if I look at our search HTML, the reason that is because the input has a name of search term. So if you make a GET request with a form, which is what we're doing, it's not a POST request, it's going to put in the URL whatever the name is here equals whatever the value for that form input. And then for the radio buttons, we have two radio buttons that have the name of type and the value of movie and the value of TV. So that's why we have here the name, which is type, and then the value, which is movie. If I do TV shows, then it's going to be type TV. Okay, so we need this data in order to do what we want. So let's go into our script, and like I said, when we hit the search HTML page, we're going to then call a function here. So let's just call this search. And then we'll go up here. I'm going to go above the slider function that we created in the last video. So let's say search movies/shows. So this is what's going to kick everything off. And we're going to make this asynchronous. Say search. Now, the very first thing we want to do is get the data from the URL. So there's a couple steps to do this. We first want to get the query string. And by query string, I mean everything from the question mark over. This is considered the query string. And then you have your query params, which are going to be, each piece of data. So to get the query string, we can simply do window.location and then search. We've used this before for the ID. So if I console log query string and I open this up, okay, we get everything from the question mark over. Now to kind of separate these out and get the data, we can use an API or an object called URL search params. So let's say const, and we'll call this URL, or let's say URL, no, we'll use lowercase, URL params. So here we can say new, and then URL all uppercase, and then search params, and then we pass in the query string. Okay, now if I console log this, say URL params, if I console log this, we're not going to see the data in here because there's some methods on the prototype that we can use here, such as get. So this works very similar to when I showed you how to use the form data API, where we did .get. So if I were to do .get, and then in here, whatever I wanted to get as far as the query params, let's say type, let's close that up, then you'll see I get TV. right? If I choose movies and I submit, then I get movie. And of course, if I want to get the search term, I would put in search term. So let's actually put those into variables, but I'm going to want to use those in other places. So my solution to this is to actually put some of this search stuff into our global state, which is way up at the top. Remember this global object. So I'm going to actually create a search object, which will have anything to do with our search state. So one will be the term, which will be just an empty string to begin with. One will be the type. You could set it to movie or show, but I'm just going to set it to an empty string. We're going to be using pagination. That's another reason I want to do this. So we'll set it to page 1 by default. And then we're also going to need the total pages, which I'm going to set that. Actually, let's not use that syntax. Say total pages, and that's going to be 1 by default. Okay, so again, this is our global state. This is stuff that we want to be able to access throughout any functions. So now what we'll do is go back down to search. And we've written quite a bit of code so far. So back down in search, what I want to set, let's see, so let's get rid of this and that. And I'm going to set my global, let's say global, so that's the object, the global object. And I'm going to set the, let's do the type. So we'll do dot, actually, sorry, it's going to be dot search dot type. And I'm going to set that to whatever that type is. All right, and then obviously we want to do that with the term as well. So let's just copy this down. And let's say global search and then term. And then we're going to get that from the URL. So here we'll say term. I'm sorry, search term, search dash term, because it's going to be whatever the name attribute is. If we look back at our form, you can see for name I have search term. If I change this to just term, then yes, we would pass term into here. Now we want to make sure that those are actually there. So for instance, if I were to not have this stuff, you know, if I don't have a search term, then I want to show an alert box here. And I'm not going to use a custom, I'm not going to use the built-in alert. I'm going to use a custom UI alert that we're going to create, which will be pretty simple. We should have an alert class in the CSS. So if we go to CSS, style, let's see, I'm pretty sure we have it. Yep, so right here, just a red background and so on. All right, now let's do a test and make sure that there's a term there. So we'll say if, and I'm going to test for it in the global scope. So let's say global or global state. So it's a search object, and then let's search for term. Now I want to make sure that it's not equal to an empty string, but I also want to make sure it's not null. So let's say, and because if you submit while it's empty, then it's going to be null. So let's say, and we want to make sure that global dot search dot term is not equal to null. Okay, so in here, this is where we're going to, I'll just say to do, make request and display results. But in the else, this is where we want to show the alert. Now, just to kind of test it out, I could do a standard JavaScript alert, and let's say, please enter a search term. So now, and you see if we just come to the page, it does that. Or if I go back to the index and I don't put anything in here, it's going to go to the page and it's going to show this alert. All right, but let's make that into a custom alert. So what we'll do is create down here, since this is kind of like a global function we could use anywhere, I want to put it down here. I'll put it right above add numbers, add comma to numbers. So let's say show error alert. Actually, let's not do error because I'm going to make it so you can pass in a class, and if you wanted to have like a success class or something, you could do that as well. So let's create our function, and I'm going to call it show alert. And it's going to take in the message that you want to output, and it's also going to take in a class name. And then let's create our element. So I'll call this alert L, and we'll set that to document dot create element. And the element we want to create is a div. And then as far as adding classes to it, let's say alert L, and let's say class list dot add. Now I do want it to have the class of alert, so I'll do that, and then we can add another argument to add another class, and that's going to be whatever the class from the show alert argument. So after that, we want to add the text. So let's say alert L, and we're going to append child, and then we want to append the text node. So document dot create text node, and that text is going to be the message that comes in from the function. Then we want to add it to the DOM. Now I do have an ID of alert, just a div. It's completely empty with an ID of alert. So we're going to grab that. So let's say query selector, and say we want the ID of alert, and then we're going to append child onto that, and then we're going to add the alert element. Okay, and then, well, actually, let's just do this for now, because I want to show you how this works. So if we go back up to search, and let's replace alert with show alert, now we have this UI alert instead of the ugly JavaScript one. However, it just stays on the page. So in order to get rid of it, what I'm going to do is use set timeout so that after a certain amount of time it goes away. So in our show alert, let's say set timeout, and that takes in a function and then also the time that I want to wait. So let's do 3 seconds. Now it's up to you if you want to create a separate remove alert function, but all we have to do is take the alert element and then call remove like that. So if I save that and it runs, it's going to show the alert, and then after 3 seconds it goes away. So now that we have that, let's go back up to the alert. And if we pass validation, then we want to make the request and display results. So the video, we're already past 12 minutes in, so let's just make the request, and then in the next video we'll move on to display the results. So basically what I want to do is have a function. So if I were to say like results, I want to have a function called search API data. So let's say we want to await on a function called search API data, which doesn't exist yet. And we don't have to pass anything in because the endpoint is going to be constructed from within the function. And then we'll do a console.log of results. Now, down here in our fetch API data, we're basically going to do the same thing in terms of like the API key and the URL. So I was thinking about how I wanted to do this. Of course, if this were excuse me, an actual production project, a serious project where you expected a lot of users, you probably don't want to put this in the client. But I think for this case, just for convenience, instead of copying this whole thing and putting this in twice, maybe we should just put these two in our global state. So I'm just going to grab this, and let's come up here and say API, and say API key, set that, and I'll move the note that I have down there, I'll move that up here, and I'm going to just paste in API URL, because that's going to be the same as well. So we'll go ahead and put that there, and then we should be able to, down in our fetch, let's replace this with global.api.api key, and this, we'll replace that with global.api API URL. And if I save, that should still work. So if we were to go to our home page, everything still should work. All right. So let's see. Let's make a request here, or search, so we don't get our alert because we do have a search term. Now we're going to be calling search API data. So what I'm going to do is copy this, and we'll put this right below the fetch. Let's say make request to search. And we're just going to call this one search API data. Doesn't take in anything. And then I'm just going to get rid of this. Okay, and like I said, I'll move this stuff up top. I'll do it off camera though. So again, we're going to show the spinner. That's going to be the same. This is where we want to kind of change things up. So we have the API URL, then we just have an endpoint here. So that is going to change. We're going to get rid of endpoint, and we want to do search, because the API URL has the ending / included, so we don't need to put it, but it's going to be /search. And then let's do /, and we'll put in here our global.search.type. Because remember, it has to be either /movie or /TV. So that is in our type, and whatever we select the radio button for gets put in our global state. So now I'm just putting it here in the URL. Then after that, we're going to need, let's see, we have our API key, and let's see, I have the language. I guess we could keep that as well. But in addition to that, we're going to do ampersand, and then we're going to need our query. So our query is going to be, let's see, API, not API, global dot search dot term. All right, so that should be whatever we put in the form, then that's what that'll put. Now, as far as the pagination goes, I'm not going to add that yet, but ultimately we're going to want to put a page on here too, but we don't need that just yet. And then the rest of this should be fine, should be the same. So back up in our search, where we call it here, we should get some results. So let's save, and let's add something in here in search, and let's open up the console. And we get an object, and you see what we get is a page, total pages, total results. That way we can add some pagination. And then the results, so it looks like I get one result here, original title, Goodfellas. Yeah, so we get 2 results. And then this one is just called Scorsese's Goodfellas, when Scorsese's the director. But yeah, so we can see we're actually getting results. If we put something else, like let's use Orphan, for example. So if I do that, we actually get 20 results for that, because that's a much more common name that's in different titles, like Orphan Horse, etc. Goodfellas obviously is very specific. So this gives us 20 results. I'm sorry, not 20 results, 162 results, just 20 at a time. That's the reason we need pagination, is because this has 9 pages, right? Goodfellas, if we do that, we only get total pages is 1, because we only have 2 results. All right, so now that we are able to do that, in the next video, let's actually show these results in the DOM.